In an idyllic place, a mother disappears from the family home.
Our kids had come home from school, she wasn't there. That was unexpected.
The door was left open. She was meant to be collecting her child from school. She didn't turn up.
Police were called to the address. Later that evening, Nat, the father, the husband, had been contacted. He was staying elsewhere at the time. Thereafter, the investigation into her as a missing person began because it was totally out of character.
Arlene Fraser, a family woman, had simply vanished.
Nobody could explain where Arlene was.
Weeks earlier, she'd been attacked. Was there a link?
Arlene was just an ordinary mum. Why would someone attempt to murder her a month before and then she goes missing?
In a case which frustrated detectives, a specialist lip reader used by Britain's security services, her identity protected, was drafted in to help uncover the truth.
And at another point, he actually mimed drawing his wrist when he was talking about cutting up the bones.
What had happened to Arlene Fraser? Detectives fear she's been abducted, murdered. And if she has, how will they solve the mystery? Every investigation is like a jigsaw, each piece offering new evidence as a picture of a suspect emerges. But which one will reveal the killer's mistake? "200 miles from Elgin in the northeast of Scotland on a blustery April evening, Carol Gillies is at home near Glasgow. Her life is about to change.
It all started with a knock on the door. There was a policeman standing there from Strathclyde Police, and he'd said, your sister's been reported missing. Right away, I felt that was it. You know, Arlene wouldn't go missing. And she had 2 children that she loved.
Nothing added up. At her home in Smith Street, Elgin, the minutiae of Arlene Fraser's life, including vital medication, were discarded.
If she'd really disappeared and run away, she would have packed the medicine she needed for her Crohn's disease. She would have packed her spectacles. She wouldn't have left her door open. She would have made arrangements, you think, as a loving mother, for her child to be picked up from school. There were all these things that were very suspicious.
A 14-year riddle of the mother who had disappeared had begun. What followed saw a cat-and-mouse game between killer and investigator. Would a murderer's mistake be uncovered in a story which begins with an inexplicable scene?
It was as if she had just been spirited away. Some of her clothing was in the bathroom, just folded and ready to be presumably worn. It looked like she had been in the middle of some housework.
The vacuum cleaner is plugged in as if she's just kind of stopped using it midway through cleaning.
Arlene was a creature of habit. She had a set routine, and she went missing on a Tuesday morning. Now, a Tuesday morning was pretty much the only period of time that she would have been at home alone, or known to be home alone by those who knew her. She went to college. She had the kids, obviously, in the evenings and the weekends. So the period of time that she would have had peace at home was really very much only on a Tuesday morning. And then she always met a friend for lunch in the town.
From looking at all Arlene's, her life, and the way she lived her life, I mean, she'd been a mother for 10 years. She was going back to college. She was doing that on a Tuesday. She was trying to build up her own wee life. The kids were now both at school.
There was a strangeness around the house, but there was no upset. There was no signs of violence. There was nothing knocked over. There was certainly no crime scene. It just looked like the house had emptied.
On the day itself, April 28th, police had little option but to ask for all of the relevant forces to be on the lookout. and then alert the public of Arlene's disappearance. Perhaps she would return.
The first thing you might consider is that they've just run away. Maybe they've run away with someone else. Maybe they've just run away by themselves. They just want to start a new life.
24 hours went by, still no sign of Arlene.
The next day, it was becoming a little bit more sinister in the sense that there was just no obvious explanation why Arlene hadn't come home.
The practicalities of a mother who suddenly vanishes from a family home present an immediate problem for those called in to help, like what to do with 2 school-aged children.
We collected the kids, Jamie and Natalie, and obviously they needed night clothes, the school uniform, etc. They're both standing in the doorway with 2 plastic bags. They just looked so bewildered and so lost as what was happening, bearing in mind Natalie was 5 and Jamie was 10, you know. For me, you know, that just rubber stamped it that this was not Arlene's doing. There was no way Arlene would do this to her children, absolutely no way.
She loved her 2 children, and there's no way she would have left the children. If she was going to run away, she would have taken the children with her. So I knew right away that Arlene was dead.
Dead. Arlene's father feared she was dead within a day of her disappearance. When evaluating the case, it's important to understand why there was such disbelief that Arlene would simply run away. It would have meant leaving a 10- and 5-year-old in an empty house because the children's father was not living in the family home. Nat Fraser, Arlene's husband, was someone investigating Detective Alan Smith, based in Glasgow, knew all about from his days as a local policeman in Elgin. Understanding Nat Fraser becomes vital to uncovering a killer's mistake.
My first conversation with Nat Fraser, the husband, was probably a matter of days after I arrived up in Elgin. I'd known Nat from a previous life. He was a local businessman. He was involved in the delivery of fruit and veg to local businesses. He was a popular individual in Elgin. He played in a local band, a music band at weekends. So he was a popular individual in the town.
Nat Fraser was an incredibly manipulative man who could make friends quite easily. He set up a business, it was very successful, and none of these things go against his general personality. He wasn't one of those people who was a loner, who kept himself away from people. He very much the opposite. He was out there, he was in control, he was the boss, he was the master of what was going on.
But he was no longer master in his own home. Arlene had seen a solicitor. She wanted a divorce. Nat had beaten her. Charged with attempted murder, later downgraded to assault, he was living out of the town on bail.
Nat Fraser had a very definite history that would have raised him as a potential risk to his wife. Some of the things that were reported about him and his behaviours would even, I think, have made him a high risk to his wife. That assault was a very, very serious one. He had put his hands around her throat and threatened her life.
The police begin to build up this picture of an unhappy relationship, one which she was trying to escape, and a potentially violent partner.
But when his wife disappeared, Nat had his sympathisers. He was a popular man. When locals and the police asked about Arlene, Nat would answer, revealing how tormented he was.
There's 2 sides to Nat Fraser. There's the public Nat Fraser, the hail fellow well met, the popular van delivery guy. Everybody in the town thinks he's a cheeky chappy, always cracking a joke, flirting with the ladies. That's one side of Nat Fraser. The other side that we began to unearth as we looked very much more closely into him as an individual is that there was very much a dark side to the private Nat Fraser. And what we saw there was quite alarming. He clearly had a history of domestic abuse. Arlene had been subjected to domestic abuse on many occasions. He was a controlling individual.
He didn't necessarily have any real loving or emotional investment in Arlene herself. And there was strong evidence of controlling and coercive behaviours and violence.
Knowing all of this, why was Nat Fraser not immediately a significant person of interest to the police?
Irrespective of our hunch, you've got to follow the evidence. And the evidence that we had was very, very thin. We didn't have a crime scene. We didn't have any witnesses. We didn't have any forensic evidence. We didn't have any CCTV that helped us. We didn't have any confessions. So we didn't have a crime. So our first challenge as an investigation was, is Arlene alive? Or has she gone missing?
There was something else which deflected suspicion from Nat Fraser. He had an alibi. He was known to be out of town delivering fruit and veg the day that Arlene went missing.
He was accompanied by a van delivery boy. His vehicle was seen on CCTV at a particular location on that particular day. He was on a telephone call to a lady who he'd previously had a relationship with but hadn't phoned in years, and ironically never phoned again. So he made sure that he was marking his scent that morning.
Detectives were in constant dialogue with Nat Fraser, but if something sinister had happened to Arlene, he had made no mistake to put him in the frame.
She had gone missing, and there was nothing to say to the contrary. He was not a suspect for months and months and months because there was no evidence.
Why had a doting mother walked out on her children? Was husband Nat involved in her disappearance? Where was Arlene Fraser? Detectives with little to go on in the hunt for Arlene Fraser simply kept a watching brief on her husband Nat. His demeanour did not compute with what they knew had been going on behind closed doors on Smith Street.
Nat's behaviours were odd around the time that she was reported missing. Now, on the evening that she was reported missing, he was staying with a friend and he had received a phone call that Arlene had gone missing. Now, in the context at that time that they were a couple going through a divorce and there was no love lost there between them, bizarrely he went straight into the Elgin where she lived, and within no time at all that evening he was checking the hospital. He was showing all signs of distress and concern, which was completely out of character.
After only a few days, he seems kind of very blasé about the whole thing, and he goes from being the extremely concerned partner to police actually having to contact him to give updates on the case. A few weeks later, he's making jokes to friends about, oh, the kids will get used to her being away and so on. That's not the behaviour of somebody who's genuinely worried about their partner and the fact that they've been missing for several weeks now.
The media locally and nationally began to speculate, but not about Nat Fraser. Coverage focused on the mother who'd abandoned her children.
There was a lot of bad press about Arlene, which was, was hard to read. There was talks of her being on drugs, which was just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, about having boyfriends, things like that.
Where were the stories coming from? None other than Nat Fraser.
And of course, naturally, those who know Arlene, that would make no sense. So he introduced some elements to create an impression that she was involved in drugs, that she was promiscuous, that she was involved in other relationships. He blackened her character.
I think these things come with the territory, but at the time you don't realise that. You just have to, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen sort of thing. So we just tried our best to kind of rise above it.
But undoubtedly this was part of Nat's plan to create an impression, plant a seed, that Arlene was into amphetamine, into drugs, which was never the case because we were able physically to get samples of Arlene's hair from a hairbrush disappearance. And that evidence scientifically told us that Arlene was not involved in drug abuse. Similarly, the relationships that he suggested and others close to Nat suggested she was involved in never came to anything.
Detectives wondered why Nat Fraser would start these stories. As the months passed, Nat pushed a plausible story. Arlene had run away. It became vital to him that the picture he painted of Arlene was seen to be true amongst the community, including the police. Arlene's betrayal of her family was a story which Nat repeated to anyone who would listen.
They believed, through fantastic propaganda by Nat Fraser and his close friends, that this woman had up sticks, abandoned her kids, disappeared, leaving him and the kids with a difficult situation. So she was being painted as a pariah.
Fraser embellished the story as the anniversary of her disappearance neared. Arlene had funded her new life with a stash of Nat's cash taken from his house. But Arlene's father, Nat's father-in-law, a quiet man, told a different story.
I knew that Arlene hadn't run away, despite what Nat Fraser was saying. I just knew because she would have phoned me on the Tuesday, so I suspected right away that she had possibly been killed.
And he had an idea of his own as to who was responsible.
They always blame the husband in murder cases, so possibly Mr. Fraser would be a prime suspect. Although I think there might have been one or two others up there. But he was a suspect.
And I think the police knew that, you know, they were looking at a murder investigation.
By 1999, detectives were convinced that Arlene had indeed been the victim of a violent crime and was dead. But if so, no killer had revealed a mistake. They set about proving their suspicions in stages. First, that Arlene was not alive.
The proof of death, which is what we were doing, the proof of death in relation to Arlene is about closing doors of life possibilities. So no activity on her bank or any finances for X period of time. No apparent interaction with pharmaceutical outlets for medication that she needed in the UK, not just locally, in the UK. Similarly with her contact lenses, or renewable contact lenses. No activity in that regard. Telephony, nothing that would suggest contact with friends, family. All of these elements had to be proved in a negative sense to be able to then say it looks very much like there's just no evidence that this woman is alive.
Nat Fraser went about his life, running his fruit and veg business around the town, in and out of the family home on Smith Street.
He maintained an impression that he thought she had gone on holiday. And I remember saying to Nat, this is some length of holiday that Arlene's gone on. And even then, he tried to maintain, no, that it was credible. She's gone off to Spain. And despite trying to reason with Nat that this is so out of character, how can you really believe this of Arlene? It just seemed illogical, incredible. But he couldn't but maintain that position, because to give an inch would be a weakness in the sense of it would have given ground back towards where he didn't want to go.
Arlene's father and sister, meanwhile, were finding it hard to cope.
It was really difficult because one minute you're living quite a normal life, you know, you're just every day, you're going to work, you've got 2 children, you're doing your housework, etc. And then all of a sudden you've stepped into this really almost dark life, you know, when you're talking, I mean, the word murder, you know, you're talking about that, that's horrible.
18 months after Arlene's disappearance, some in the police had concluded there'd been foul play. And privately, some acknowledged that they had a suspect, the same man that the family believed responsible, the man who was about to face charges for the attack on Arlene 5 weeks before she went missing, Nat Fraser. There seemed to be no other theories possible.
The question has to be who would gain the most from Arlene's disappearance. Now, in terms of motivation, Nat had a huge amount of motivation to get rid of Arlene.
And statistically speaking, when a woman is murdered, in about half of cases, it's a partner or ex-partner who turns out to be to blame. So Nat Fraser is going to be an obvious suspect.
The number one motivation was that he was already awaiting criminal trial for her attempted murder just weeks before she disappeared. So freedom, if she wasn't there to give evidence, was obvious. The second thing is we knew that she had been in talks with her solicitor around about a divorce settlement, a 6-figure divorce settlement, which was going to hugely damage him financially. Motivation number two, with Arlene out of the equation, he's not going to lose his money. If Arlene was no longer there, he would get back into the family home, he would control that, he would get back with the kids and control that. All of his finances, he would be back in control. So from a perspective of motivation, there was no shortage of motivation.
Whilst there were still plenty of people in Elgin who supported the popular Nat Fraser, time was not on his side. By the second anniversary of Arlene's disappearance, there seemed no sensible reason to support the claim that she had abandoned her children and left home.
It was only the passage of time, weeks, months, years with some individuals, before they began to reflect on the likelihood of this as being sensible. You know, birthdays had passed, Christmases had passed. The kids, she was a devoted mother. The one thing that we knew was that she was a devoted mother. And yet birthdays passed, Christmases passed. It was absolutely illogical.
I mean, obviously the police were getting information from all angles about Arlene. They would talk to her friends, they would talk to Nat Fraser, and most importantly, they talk to the people that actually, you know, really know her.
But Nat had an impregnable alibi, and there was no body to confirm Arlene was dead. Neither Arlene nor her remains had been found. She might still be alive. So what charge could detectives possibly bring? If she had been murdered, they needed the killer to reveal a mistake. Nat Fraser, a suspect as time passed for something, but for what? A turning point in the case came when a key piece of evidence was uncovered. An Elgin mechanic revealed that he'd sold a vehicle to a friend of Nat Fraser.
The case went very quiet, and then there was talk of a car being used, a beige Fiesta.
We uncovered a significant break for the first time in relation to a vehicle.
And police were very excited about this, and I think it is relevant to the inquiry.
And the Ford Fiesta had been purchased the night before Arlene had gone missing, the 27th of April, by a very close associate of Nat Fraser, in circumstances that could only be described as very covert, cash in hand and say nothing. There was a third party used to purchase the vehicle.
Car was purchased the night before Arlene went missing, and then it was disposed of.
And so that vehicle, the whereabouts of that vehicle, sightings of that vehicle, really re-energised the investigation, because we began to believe that the purchase of that vehicle was inextricably linked to her disappearance. And could that have been the vehicle that was enticed her out?
Police had a lead. They summed it up like this. A car had been bought by a Fraser confidant the day before Arlene had disappeared, and then it had been destroyed.
It's very, very strange. Why would you do that?
Other inexplicable evidence had been uncovered, like the mystery of the missing and then reappearing wedding rings.
The initial crime scene examination of the house within a day of Arlene gone missing. The house was sealed and it was looked at forensically, and including that forensic examination was a full video sweep of the house. Days after that, once the family had moved back into the home, one of the family members recovered from the bathroom 3 rings: Arlene's wedding ring, engagement ring and eternity ring. But they hadn't been there during the course of the video. Now bear in mind, Nat had had fairly regular and free access to the house at that point in time. So the belief was that the rings had been returned to the house by Nat.
He was crazy to think that the police hunting for this woman who's gone missing, and even her family, wouldn't notice that the rings weren't there and then they've suddenly appeared again. So that really suggests that somebody has gone in and planted those rings, and he's doing it to support his story that she's just run off and she was trying to leave him. But you know, if she was running off, really trying to run off and leave him, surely she would have taken her rings and tried to sell them for money.
It seemed such an obvious mistake from Nat. Why would he not dispose of the rings? Why commit the cardinal error of returning to the scene of a crime, so further exposing himself to suspicion? Alan Smith put it down to Nat's greed.
As unbelievable as that might be, it is not that unbelievable if you understand how close Nat is to money and the value of these rings. And by reintroducing them into the family home was his way of being able to regain control of the rings and their value.
Yet another piece of evidence emerged to further draw suspicion on Nat Fraser. His story about Arlene walking out on the family with Nat's cash kept in the house. It simply wasn't true.
So his assertion was that Arlene had taken the money and disappeared, and it was all part of the plan, her plan. But what he was unaware of was that days before Arlene went missing, she'd humiliatingly had to borrow money from a friend for housekeeping. So she was low on cash. Now, if she had known there was a stash of cash in the house, she wouldn't have had to borrow from a friend. Never would have. So that didn't square. And even if that stash had been uncovered post-borrowing money, Arlene would not have gone missing without having repaid her friend the money. So that whole staged piece of theatre by Nat to again build on the fact she's gone missing and ran off and abandoned her family, when you actually looked in behind that, that was a mistake.
But there was still a big problem to overcome for police to prove that Nat was a killer. With so many sightings of Fraser miles away from Smith Street, home of Arlene, on the day that she went missing, how could Fraser be responsible? Police dug deeper into the part played in the mystery by a friend of Fraser, a man called Hector Dick.
So Hector Dick was a business partner.
It was Hector Dick who bought the now destroyed beige Ford Fiesta and may have helped dispose of Arlene's body.
Nat believed that if Arlene's body was never found, there could never be a conviction for murder. So his real driving force, I think, was in her body disposal, her body deposition.
In a rare twist at this point in their investigation, the year 2000, police had Nat Fraser exactly where they wanted him, in prison. Whilst the investigation into her disappearance and possible murder continued, Fraser had been tried for the assault of Arlene, for which he'd been arrested in 1998. Convicted, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. During this time, a third person entered the police investigation, another friend of Nat Fraser, a man called Glenn Lucas. He visited Fraser inside prison. Neither men knew they were being filmed. There was no audio on the tape, so detectives turned to a deaf, identity-protected lip-reading expert to help uncover what had been said. Nat Fraser was doing most of the talking.
And he said something about if the bones are smaller than that. He actually held up his hand. If the bones are smaller than that, they cannot be identified by DNA.
The conversation between Fraser and his visitor Glenn Lucas seemed to confirm the prosecution case. Nat knew an awful lot more than he'd admitted.
And at another point, he actually mimed sawing his wrist when he was talking about cutting up the bones. And Lucas was saying, no, good idea. Police don't suspect you at all. And stuff like that. And telling him that he thought very much that Nat would get away with it.
Whilst they didn't deliver hard evidence that was able to be admissible in court, what it did do was give us significantly interesting intelligence.
And Nat was talking about how many alibis he'd had, how he'd been very sure that when he made the deliveries, that everybody had seen him. I could tell they were talking about cutting up bones, but I didn't know whose bones. I didn't even know that someone was missing, let alone dead.
And that reinvigorated the investigation and gave us a number of lines of inquiry.
The information given by the lip reader did not offer new evidence, but it did confirm the case against Nat Fraser and his harrowing crime.
They were talking about a third party called Hackey, and how much Hackey had helped him. There was mention of a car and a mobile phone, and I don't know what or how he had Arlene killed, but there was a mention of a third party who had offered or agreed to hurt Arlene for a price.
By 2002, Alan Smith felt that he and the team had assembled enough to gain convictions related to the murder of Arlene Fraser against 3 men. Glenn Lucas was considered an accomplice to a conspiracy alongside Hector Dick, with Nat Fraser the orchestrator of the abduction and murder of Arlene Fraser.
We had no hard and fast silver bullet, no forensic DNA link between the victim and the perpetrator. We didn't have the luxury of that in this investigation.
Despite the absence of a piece of smoking gun evidence, Fraser, Hector Dick and Glenn Lucas were charged. What followed transformed Elgin from a delightful market town on the coast to the scene of complex legal arguments in court and the continued probing by police into what had happened to Arlene Fraser. Elgin and the picturesque Moray Firth became a temporary home to legal experts and senior detectives as prosecution and defence teams argued about, amongst other things, whether Nat Fraser and his alleged accomplices could ever get a fair trial in the small town. Eventually, it was decided to move the case to another town, Dingwall, 52 miles away. But 4 years after her disappearance, 3 men, including her husband, were due to stand trial for the murder of Arlene Fraser. The case was thought by some dangerously thin, but as the trial neared, one of Nat Fraser's friends turned against him.
He thought that he could confide in other people and that they would remain loyal to him. It didn't occur to him that they would not be loyal to him.
Hector Dick now offered to support the prosecution case, and he made an amazing revelation.
He claimed that Fraser had hired a hitman from down south, that Arlene had been abducted, killed, her body dismembered, and then her body was ground up and burned, and then her ashes were disposed of. He also claimed that Fraser had asked him to acquire a car to help with the abduction.
Charges against Hector Dick were dropped, as were those against Glenn Lucas. At last, Arlene's sister could have her day in court to put the record straight about Arlene. She was far from relaxed about it. Nothing was certain about the outcome.
Being a witness in a high court is very, very scary. You know, it's really scary.
Well, it was quite an experience because you're in the box, you're trying to answer accused questions, and half the time my hearing aids weren't working. So it was a bit of a challenge.
It's just not a nice atmosphere at all. They have a way of doing things and you're asked a question and it's a yes or no, and you come away feeling very frustrated because they've asked the question but you want to say, but, you know, but no, it's a yes or no, so you feel kind of unfulfilled.
What would be the outcome? Had Nat Fraser made a killer's mistake? Would he be found guilty of the murder of Arlene Fraser? Carol Gillies and her father Hector attended on the verdict of the court in January 2003, just 3 months short of 5 years since Arlene had disappeared. Nat Fraser was found guilty. The judge offered his opinion of Arlene's killer.
The judge made it very clear that he felt that this was an evil crime. It was without any care for anybody else. It was planned, it was brutal, it involved other people. It even hurt, you know, his own child. So when the judge described him as evil, that's quite a big step to take. That's almost saying there is no mitigation in what you did whatsoever.
But if the people of Elgin thought that it was case closed, they were wrong. Nat Fraser would appeal and his conviction would be quashed.
Well, today's the day we'll find out if police and prosecution have withheld evidence, if they're allowed to withhold evidence.
In 2008, after a series of court hearings both in Scotland and in London, on a legal technicality related to the Crown's evidence about the rings found in the Fraser family home.
There was a question, a technical question, in relation to the integrity of the chain of evidence and the way that those rings were handled by the police. And on the basis of that, the conviction was quashed because the rings played such a significant part in the first trial. And that was devastating. It was devastating for the police and the inquiry team, but it was doubly devastating for Arlene's family.
Oh, it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible.
And of course we were disappointed. We were bitterly disappointed.
The quashing of the conviction for the whole family was just devastating, absolutely devastating. The whole court process for each and every one of us it was just a living nightmare. It seemed so unfair to everybody involved.
Buoyed by his success in winning his appeal, Nat Fraser reverted to type.
The old Nat came back. It was as if everything had lifted and he was back to being the cheeky chappie in the high street in Elgin delivering his fruit and veg. He could not contain himself. And the family had to endure that. And it was hard, but he reverted to type. Nat reverted to type. And so that absolutely was all the motivation that was needed, if any was needed, to get this train back on the track. Let's get this investigation and redouble our efforts to get him back into court.
Police and prosecutors reconsidered their evidence. It may have seemed easier to let the investigation rest, but detectives wanted to take their case back to court.
And so he went on trial for a second time, and this again was the first time that an individual who had a conviction quashed was re-indicted and put on trial for murder for the same crime.
In 2012, Nat Fraser returned to court charged with the murder of his wife Arlene. Would the case against him once again convince a jury? Had he made a mistake, or would the cheeky chappie win the day and walk free?
We always remember sitting in a room, we could hear them saying, jury verdict, court 3, jury verdict, court 3. And away up the stairs we went. I mean, hearts were beating, absolutely beating.
She need not have worried. For a second time, a Scottish jury found Nat Fraser guilty.
It was just the relief. You try not to be, jump in the air. You try to stay composed, but the relief is unbelievable, just unbelievable, because The alternative was that he would just walk through the doors and it would have all been in vain. And you know, and Arlene would still be out there, and that seems so unfair.
Arlene's body remains undiscovered. It's somewhere out there, but the trial outcome did bring some consolation.
I don't suppose you could call it joy, but it was a relief, because we were down in London at the Supreme Court, and it didn't seem to be going too well for us. So I was a bit worried.
Nat Fraser was sentenced to life in prison for a second time. He will serve a minimum of 17 years. It had taken 14 years to bring him to justice. What was the key mistake which convinced a second jury to find him guilty? It was the crime scene itself which betrayed the truths Nat Fraser wanted to be kept hidden. If he was to be believed, the town of Elgin had been harbouring a selfish mother who had taken what money the family had and then set off on an extended holiday to Spain, having abandoned her children. But why would she leave behind vital medicine and her glasses? The unlikely claims by Fraser that a devoted mother would abandon her children, a wife who had already sought refuge from the abuses of her husband, did not ring true. Too many people knew too much about the nature of Arlene and that of Nat Fraser.
Nat Fraser thought he'd planned the perfect murder, but what he couldn't do is erase people's memories. He couldn't erase the things Arlene had told her solicitor and her friends about their relationship. The fact that he tried to kill her previously. They couldn't erase the fact that she was a wonderful mother and that she cared about her children. And when she didn't turn up to pick up her children from school, that rang alarm bells. That was out of character for her.
So that, for many, is the killer's mistake which Nat Fraser made, planning a story which asked people to believe that a doting mother and family woman would leave behind her children, and for what it's worth, vital medication too. It was that which convinced police, 2 juries, and her sister that Nat Fraser was guilty of murdering Arlene Fraser, a woman who nobody could believe would abandon her children.
She wouldn't do that to her family and her parents and her sister. She just wouldn't, because she knows us. She knows how we would, you know, the grief, the worry. There's no way that she would put us through that. No way.